taken on board, it needs to be first and foremost understood. And there are a couple of things that we all can do to ensure that this actually happens. So the first thing is being clear in the language, and that refers to a couple of things. So first of all, being clear about the language of the discipline. So clearly explaining to the students what being analytical means in the context of your discipline means, or for example, what synthesis means in the context of your discipline. Another thing to make students aware of and to be clear about is what is absolutely necessary for students to do and what is just a piece of advice. And especially for international students, phrases such as "you might want to consider this," "you might want to do that," can be quite unclear and come across just as a suggestion when sometimes it is meant as something that absolutely needs to happen for students to pass or to improve their piece of work. Final thing to consider in terms of clarity are the rules around politeness. So politeness is quite often used as a way to maybe minimize emotional impact of criticism, and it can have quite a negative effect on students' uptake of feedback in terms of them not understanding that politeness is there just to kind of cushion the blow, as is quite often used in feedback sandwich, and they take it as a given, which then contrasted with a grade that they receive creates a quite an unfavorable picture of feedback and a quite unfavorable picture of the person giving the feedback. It is also important to keep the feedback balanced, so pointing out the criticism and areas for improvement. I think the areas of improvement and focusing on that is quite important, especially when giving critical feedback, but also offering elements of praise. And I think there can be quite a lot of confusion around the elements of praise, and it can be misused as it quite often is the case with feedback sandwich, when it doesn't really generally praise students' performance, but rather serves as a mean to minimize criticism. So it is important to keep the feedback balanced, but the praise should be genuine and actually praise the elements the student did good and not serve as an emotional tool. And on that note of balance and balancing praise with criticism, it is useful to detach those two. So what we sometimes see in feedback that an element of praise is followed with but or with however, and that can have quite an emotional effect on the students and lead to lack of uptake of feedback, of some misunderstanding. So for example, those students who are overly confident will focus on the praise part but ignore the criticism, and the other way around, those students who might have a little bit of lower self-esteem will focus on the negatives and ignore the praise. And if two pieces of information are important, so both the praise and critique, it is really useful to separate those two. So for example, say what students did well, and then in the next sentence say the areas that need to be improved. For feedback to be taken on board, it's quite useful and quite important to prioritize big aspects. So students can be overwhelmed with the amount of feedback that they get. I mean, think about the amount of feedback that you might get from the reviewer and what emotional impact it might have on you. So it is useful to prioritize 2 or 3 or 4 things that are manageable for the students. So moving away from the good feedback to be thought of in terms of the quantity rather than action. So what can student generally action, and focus your points on that. And finally, commenting on the piece of work rather than the person. So detaching the feedback from the person and attaching it to the piece of work can have a good emotional effect on the uptake and also on student self-esteem.